Yorkshire, 1944. The truck rattled to a stop outside a cluster of brick buildings that seemed to crouch against the English rain, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and coal smoke. Through the canvas flaps, German women pressed their faces forward, straining to see what awaited them. They had been told what to expect in British captivity. Starvation rations, hard labour, perhaps worse. What they saw instead stopped their whispers cold. British guards stood beside a wooden sign, painted white with neat black letters. Camp Library. All prisoners welcome. For a moment, no one spoke. Everything they had been taught about enemy brutality, about Allied intentions, about their own fate, was about to be tested against something they never imagined possible. Books. Before we explore this extraordinary story, if you've made it this far, you're exactly the kind of person who keeps history alive. So do me one favour, tap like, so this story isn't buried, show support by subscribing so you don't miss the next chapter, and share this video so more people discover the truth history tried to hide. These stories must be remembered. The journey had begun 6 weeks earlier on a cold morning outside Calais. Margareta Weber stood among 180 women in a bombed-out factory courtyard, her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform torn at the shoulder from the blast that had ended her war. She was 28, a radio operator who had transmitted coded messages from France to Berlin for 3 years. Around her, nurses, clerks, factory supervisors, even a librarian from Dresden, all captured as the Allied advance rolled through occupied France. They had expected immediate execution. The propaganda had been explicit. The British were cruel, sadistic, eager to humiliate German women. Instead, they received medical attention, delousing procedures, and coarse grey dresses stamped with PW in red paint. The letters felt like a brand, marking them as something less than human. The Channel crossing was brutal. Seasickness, cold that seeped through thin blankets, the constant pitch and roll of a military transport. Women clung to whatever they could, some praying, others crying silently into the darkness. Margaret kept a small notebook hidden in her dress pocket, writing by the weak light that filtered through gaps in the hull. November 3rd, 1944. We cross to England now. I cannot imagine what England will do to captured German women. My sister's letters said the British bomb civilians without mercy. What mercy will they show us? The English weather struck them like a physical force when the ship docked in Dover. Not the sharp cold of German winter, but something damp and penetrating, rain that fell in sheets, turning the world grey and indistinct. Fog rolled across the harbour, muting colours, softening edges. Women stumbled down gangplanks, shivering in clothes designed for French summers, blinking in light that seemed filtered through layers of wet wool. British soldiers lined the dock. This was the first surprise. Not the brutal thugs of propaganda, but young men who looked tired, professional, almost bored. Their uniforms were worn but clean, weapons held loosely, no aggression in their posture. One soldier, his face weathered beyond his years, helped an elderly German woman who missed a step. His hand steadied her elbow. She flinched, expecting violence. He simply nodded and moved to help the next woman. Margaret watched this and felt the first small crack in her certainty about the world. The transport trucks were canvas-covered, open to the wind. They drove north through countryside, unlike anything the women had seen. Green fields even in November, stone walls dividing land into neat parcels, villages with church spires piercing low clouds. Everything seemed smaller than Germany, more compact, as if the entire country had been built to a different scale. Sheep grazed in meadows. Smoke rose from cottage chimneys, life continuing as if there were no war. "Where are they taking us?" Helga Richter whispered in German. She was 22, a telephone operator from Berlin, young enough to still believe rescue might somehow come. No one answered. The British guards in the truck cab didn't speak to them, but their silence wasn't menacing. They simply drove, occasionally passing back canteens of water when the jolting road made someone nauseous. One guard, noticing a woman about to be sick, stopped the convoy in the shelter of trees until she recovered. These small courtesies confused the prisoners more than cruelty would have. Camp 18 emerged from the Yorkshire moors like something from a different era. Rows of brick barracks arranged in precise lines, surrounded by wire fences that looked almost decorative compared to the barriers of German camps. Guard towers stood at intervals, but the men inside read newspapers, drank tea from thermoses, seemed more concerned with staying dry than watching prisoners. The camp commandant was a British major named Edmund Hartley. This fact alone was remarkable. A gentleman officer, educated, measured, standing on the headquarters steps as the trucks arrived, his uniform impeccable despite the rain. "You will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention," he said through a female translator, a German woman who had lived in Britain before the war. His voice carried authority but no cruelty. "You will work, you will be fed, you will be housed, you will not be harmed, follow regulations, and you will find conditions here tolerable." The German women stood in formation, rain soaking through thin dresses, trying to process these words. Fed, housed, not harmed. It had to be deception, some elaborate British trick before the real treatment began. Major Hartley dismissed them to barracks. The buildings were simple but solid, brick walls that held heat. Wooden bunks with actual mattresses, thin but real. Lockers for personal items they didn't have. Windows with glass panes, not just shutters. Small coal stoves in each barracks for warmth. And in the corner of every building, something that made women stop and stare. A bookshelf. Not empty, but filled with books. German books. "This is how they mock us," an older woman named Frau Becker muttered. "They show us books we cannot read while we starve." But the starvation never came. Morning arrived at 6 o'clock. Roll call in the compound yard, mist rising from wet ground, the world still half dark. British guards counted the women with careful precision, then directed them to the mess hall. This was where the second great shock occurred. The mess hall was a long brick building with tall windows and rows of wooden tables. Women filed in expecting thin soup, perhaps stale bread, the near-starvation diet that had become normal across Europe. Instead, they found metal trays loaded with porridge, powdered eggs, bread with margarine, tea with milk and sugar. Real food, hot food, more food than many had seen in months. Margaret stared at her tray as if it might vanish. Around her, women sat frozen, afraid to touch what must be illusion. One woman began crying, silent tears cutting through the grime on her face. A British soldier serving the line noticed their hesitation. He spoke no German, but his gesture was universal. He took a piece of bread, bit into it, smiled slightly, nodded toward their trays. Permission granted. The women ate slowly, deliberately, each bite a small ceremony. The porridge was thick and warm. The eggs were reconstituted, but tasted of something beyond hunger. The bread was dense and filling. The tea was hot and sweet. In Germany, civilians were eating turnips and hoping for potato peels. Here, prisoners ate better than free Germans. The guilt from this realization was immediate and overwhelming. The work assignments came after breakfast. Some women were sent to the camp laundry, others to kitchens, still others to maintenance duties or to work on nearby farms. The labour was real, but not crushing. 8-hour days with breaks. Tea brought round mid-morning and mid-afternoon, supervisors who corrected mistakes with patience rather than violence, and everywhere this strange British civility, please and thank you, as if prisoners deserved courtesy. But it was the library that changed everything. On the third day, Major Hartley made an announcement during evening roll call. The rain had stopped, and weak sunlight broke through clouds, turning puddles into mirrors of gold. "The camp library is open to all prisoners," he said through the translator. "You may borrow books. You may sit and read during free hours. There are books in German, books in English for those who wish to learn, newspapers, journals. Knowledge is not a weapon. It is a bridge." The women stood silent, not believing. A library. For prisoners. For enemies. Helga leaned close to Margareta. "It must be propaganda," she whispered. "Books that tell lies about Germany, about the war." That evening, after the supper of vegetable stew and bread that would have been a feast in Hamburg, a small group of women approached the library building. It was a converted barracks. Shelves built floor to ceiling along every wall. A British soldier sat at a desk near the door, a ledger open before him. He looked up as they entered, smiled slightly, gestured toward the shelves. No challenge, no threat, just welcome. Margareta walked slowly down the first aisle, running her fingers along spines. Goethe, Schiller, Thomas Mann, Hesse. The great German authors, not banned, not burned, simply here, waiting. Poetry, history, science, philosophy. Novels in German, some published before the war, others she recognized from before the madness began. Her hands trembled as she pulled a volume from the shelf. Der Steppenwolf, by Hermann Hesse. She opened to the first page, seeing words in her own language, words that spoke of searching and meaning and the complexity of human existence. "Is this really allowed?" she asked the British soldier in halting English. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Why wouldn't it be? Around her, other women were discovering similar treasures. Helga found a book of Rilke's poetry and pressed it to her chest like something precious. Frau Becker, the skeptical older woman, stood before a shelf of history texts, her face showing something between confusion and hunger. The Dresden librarian, Anna Zimmermann, moved through the stacks with tears streaming down her face, touching books like old friends she thought lost forever. "They have everything," Anna whispered. "Everything the Reich banned. Everything they said would corrupt us. It's all here." That night, women sat on their bunks reading by the weak light of overhead bulbs. Some read silently, lost in worlds beyond wire fences. Others read aloud, sharing passages, rediscovering language that wasn't propaganda, wasn't commands, wasn't fear. Margaret sat with her Hesse novel and realized she hadn't read anything for pleasure in 3 years. The war had taken that from her, among so many other things. And now, here, as a prisoner in enemy territory, it was being given back. The library became a kind of sanctuary. Women went during every free moment, some to read, others simply to sit among books, to be in a place that valued thought over obedience. A British corporal named William Preston managed the library. He was 45, too old for combat duty, assigned to camp administration after serving in the First War. He spoke some German, learned during occupation duty in the Rhineland after 1918. Margaret encountered him one afternoon when she came to return her Hesse and borrow something new. The library was quiet, rain drumming on the roof, weak November light barely penetrating the windows. Preston sat at his desk, reading something himself. He looked up as she approached. "Did you enjoy it?" he asked in careful German. She hesitated, then decided truth was safer than pretense. "I had forgotten books could be beautiful, that words could mean something beyond orders and reports." Preston marked her return in his ledger. "What did they tell you about us? About the British?" She met his eyes. "They said you were degenerate, that you had no culture, no discipline, that you bombed civilians for sport and would torture prisoners for amusement. And now?" His voice was gentle, curious, without judgment. "Now I don't know what to believe about anything." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to rain, the distant murmur of voices from other barracks, the rustle of pages as another prisoner somewhere in the stacks turned a page. Preston leaned back in his chair. "Why books?" Margaret asked suddenly. "Why give us books?" Preston considered this, choosing his words carefully. Because we believe that education defeats hatred, that knowledge dissolves propaganda, that people who read widely cannot easily be convinced that others are less than human. He paused. Your government burned books, destroyed libraries, declared certain authors degenerate. We believe that was not incidental to the horror that followed. It was foundational. Margaret felt something shift inside her. You think we can be re-educated? Changed. I think you're already changing. I think every woman who walks through that door and picks up a banned book is choosing to think for herself again. That's not re-education. That's liberation. That night, Margaret wrote in her notebook, Today, I understood that we lost the war long before the armies did. We lost it when we started burning books, when we decided some thoughts were too dangerous to allow. The British have already won by doing the opposite. They give us the very things our government forbade, and in doing so, they show us what we could have been. December brought deeper cold, frost on windows, breath visible, even inside barracks. But the library remained warm, the coal stove kept burning through the evenings. Women came in increasing numbers, some learning English from textbooks Preston provided. Others reading German classics they'd been denied, still others discovering authors they'd never heard of because the Reich had banned them. A curious thing happened. Women began discussing what they read. Book clubs formed spontaneously. Arguments about philosophy, about literature, about history that wasn't filtered through Nazi ideology. Helga and 3 others met weekly to read and discuss Thomas Mann, whose books had been burned in Berlin before the war. They grappled with ideas about art and politics, about the responsibility of intellectuals, about what Germany had become. Frau Becker, who had initially dismissed the library as mockery, became one of its most devoted users. She read voraciously, history primarily, trying to understand how everything had gone so wrong. One evening, she approached Margaret in the library aisle. I found something, she said, her voice strange. British accounts of what happened in Poland, in Russia, what our soldiers did to civilians. She held a newspaper, hands shaking. Is this propaganda? Are these lies? Margaret looked at the paper. The Times, dated 1942, reporting on atrocities in occupied territories, accounts from witnesses, photographs that made her stomach turn. She wanted to say it was lies, wanted to dismiss it as enemy propaganda. But she remembered things she'd heard, rumours from soldiers, stories quickly silenced. She remembered orders she'd transmitted in code, never asking what they meant. I don't know, she said finally, but I think we have to consider that it might be true. That night, Frau Becker didn't sleep. She sat on her bunk, reading by lamplight. Working through newspaper archives Preston had quietly made available. Articles about concentration camps, about mass killings, about a systematic attempt to eliminate entire peoples. Some of the other women refused to look, insisted it was lies. But others joined Frau Becker, reading with growing horror, beginning to understand what had been done in their names. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It came in small moments, accumulating like water eroding stone. A guard named Sergeant Thomas Cooper helped women understand English poetry, patiently explaining idioms and references. He was kind without being condescending, respectful without forgetting they were technically enemies. His simple humanity undermined everything the propaganda had claimed about British cruelty. In the camp library one afternoon, Anna Zimmermann, the Dresden librarian, discovered something that made her cry out. A card catalogue, handwritten, meticulous, organising every book in the collection by author, title and subject. She ran her fingers over the cards, recognising the system she'd used in her own library before being conscripted. This is professional work, she said to Preston, wonder in her voice. This is how a real library should be organised. Preston smiled. We had help from a librarian, German refugee who fled in '38. She consulted on the collection, helped us understand what might matter to prisoners far from home. A German helped you build this? For us. A human being helped us build this. For other human beings, that's all. Christmas approached. The women expected nothing, certainly not celebration. But on Christmas Eve, something extraordinary happened. The camp held a concert in the mess hall. Not mandatory propaganda, but optional attendance. Women filed in curious, suspicious, ready to leave if this proved to be mockery. Instead, they found British soldiers with instruments. A pianist, a violinist, a singer with a voice that carried like light through darkness. They played Handel's Messiah. The music was complex, beautiful, requiring incredible skill. The soloist's voice rose and fell, carrying ancient words about hope and redemption, about light in darkness. Some of the German women knew this music from before the war, from churches their government had later tried to control or close. Hearing it again, in this place, from these people they'd been taught to hate, broke something inside them. Margaret watched the British pianist's hands move across keys, watched the concentration on the violinist's face, watched the singer pour his soul into each phrase. This was art at the highest level. These were cultured, educated people choosing to share beauty with their prisoners. Everything she'd been taught said this was impossible. The British were supposed to be crude, materialistic, without true culture. Yet here they were, performing music written by a German composer, offering it as gift to German captives. When the concert ended, the silence lasted for several heartbeats. Then slowly, women began to applaud. Some were crying. Others sat stunned. The British performers bowed slightly, no triumph in their gesture, simply acknowledgement. Major Hartley stood at the back of the hall, watching. His face showed satisfaction but not pride. This was simply what civilized people did. After Christmas, something changed in the camp. Women stopped waiting for the cruelty to begin. They started accepting that this was real, that they were truly being treated with basic human dignity. And with that acceptance came something more difficult, the need to reconcile what they'd believed with what they were experiencing. Margaret sought out Preston in the library one January afternoon. Snow fell outside, muffling sound, turning the camp into something almost beautiful. She found him shelving returned books, his movements methodical, careful. "I need to tell you something," she said in English that had improved through months of reading. He turned, gestured to a reading table. They sat, snow falling beyond windows, the library warm and quiet. "When I was in Germany, serving the Wehrmacht, I knew things were happening. Not everything, but something. I heard rumours about camps, about Jews being sent away and not returning. I told myself it wasn't my concern, that if the government did it, there must be reasons. I told myself many lies, so I wouldn't have to face truth." Preston listened, his face neutral, not encouraging or condemning, just listening. "And I believed what they said about other nations, about the British, the Americans, the Russians. I believed you were less civilized than us, less cultured, less capable of creating beauty or meaning. I believed these things because it made me feel superior, because it let me avoid questioning what my country was doing." She paused, tears starting. "I was wrong about everything, and the worst part is, I chose not to see. The information was there. I could have known. I just decided not to." The silence stretched. Snow fell. Somewhere in the stacks, another prisoner quietly turned a page. Preston finally spoke. "Ignorance is comfortable. It asks nothing of you. Knowledge is harder. It demands response, action, moral reckoning." He looked at her directly. "The question isn't whether you were wrong. You were. The question is what you do with that understanding now. What can I do? I'm a prisoner, powerless. You can read. You can think. You can refuse to stop questioning. And when you eventually return to Germany, you can teach others to do the same. That's not powerless. That's how civilization rebuilds itself, one mind at a time. Do you forgive me?" The question came out as a whisper. Preston shook his head slowly. That's not mine to give. The people who suffered under your government, who died in camps, who lost everything, they're the ones who could forgive. Most of them are gone." He paused. "What I can offer is belief that people can change, that education and exposure to truth can transform understanding, that even after terrible wrongs, there's still possibility for different futures. What do I do with the guilt? Use it. Let it fuel your commitment to never letting such things happen again. Guilt that just sits is useless. Guilt that motivates action can change worlds." Spring came slowly to Yorkshire. By March, days were longer, warmer. The library's collection had grown as more books arrived, donated by British civilians who heard about the camp's educational programme. Some donations came with notes. "For our German prisoners, in hope of better understanding." These acts of generosity from civilians whose cities were still being bombed created a cognitive dissonance so complete it forced transformation. Helga, the young Berlin telephone operator, had begun teaching herself English in earnest. She spent hours with grammar texts, dictionaries, newspapers. Her goal was simple. She wanted to read English literature in its original language, to understand the culture she'd been taught to despise. Preston helped her, patient with mistakes, encouraging progress. One afternoon, she successfully read an entire poem by William Wordsworth, understanding it without translation. She looked up from the page, eyes bright. "They taught us English writers were shallow," she said, "that English couldn't express complex emotions like German, but this," she gestured to the poem. "This is profound," Preston smiled. "Every language can express the full range of human experience. Believing otherwise was just another way to make you feel superior, to justify aggression." By summer, the library had become the centre of camp life. Women organised reading circles, language exchanges, even informal lectures on topics from history to science. Anna Zimmermann, the Dresden librarian, began cataloguing new arrivals, working alongside Preston, rebuilding her professional identity even in captivity. The work detail assignments evolved. Women with education were encouraged to teach others. Reading classes formed for those who'd had limited schooling. English lessons expanded. Even mathematics and science were taught, using books from the library. The camp was becoming almost accidentally a school for adults who had been denied real education under Nazi rule. News from Germany grew darker. Cities reduced to rubble. The Eastern Front collapsing. Rumours of what Soviet troops were doing in occupied territories. Women received letters from home when mail service was established, reading accounts of starvation, destruction, chaos. Margaret's letter from her mother in Stuttgart described eating grass to survive, living in a basement because their building was destroyed, watching neighbours die from cold and hunger. "You are fortunate to be where you are," her mother wrote. "At least the British remember humanity." This created the same strange inversion as in American camps. Being a prisoner in Britain was safer, healthier, more hopeful than being free in Germany. The guilt from this reality was crushing. Some women, like Frau Becker, clung to old beliefs, insisting Germany would somehow triumph, that all of this was temporary. But her voice grew weaker with each passing month, drowned out by evidence, by reality, by the simple fact that the world they'd believed in was ash. In May, the war in Europe ended. Major Hartley called an assembly in the compound square. The rain had finally stopped, and weak sunshine broke through Yorkshire clouds. Women stood in formation, waiting, uncertain what peace would mean for them. "The war is concluded," Hartley said through the translator. "You will be repatriated over the coming year. The process will take time. Until then, camp operations continue as established." He paused, looking over the assembled women. "I want you to understand something clearly. When you return to Germany, people will ask about your treatment here. Some may not believe you. Some will say you're lying, or that you've been compromised. But I need you to tell the truth regardless." The women listened, silent, but attentive. Tell them that you are held in accordance with international law. Tell them that we provided you with food, shelter, medical care, and education. Tell them that we gave you books, taught you languages, treated you as human beings capable of thought and growth. His voice strengthened. Tell them that the ideology that led to this war was built on lies about other peoples, other cultures, other nations. Tell them that respect for human dignity, for education, for the free exchange of ideas is not weakness, but strength. He gestured toward the library building. Your government burned books and called it purification. We gave you books and called it civilization. The difference between those actions is the difference between tyranny and freedom. When you rebuild Germany, remember which approach led to prosperity and which led to ruin. That evening, many women went to the library one last time before sleep. They sat among the books that had transformed them, touching spines, reading favourite passages, trying to memorize what they'd learned. Margaret found Preston at his desk, updating the catalogue. I want to thank you, she said, not just for the books, but for treating us like we were still human, like we were worth the effort of education. Preston looked up. You were always worth it. The question was never whether you deserved knowledge. The question was whether you'd choose to use it for good. I will. I promise you. I'll spend the rest of my life teaching what I learned here. That books matter more than bullets. That culture is stronger than propaganda. That education is the only real defense against hatred. Then none of this was wasted. Repatriation began in earnest that autumn. Groups of women were processed, given travel documents, loaded onto trucks heading south to ports. Margaret's group was scheduled for November, exactly 1 year after her arrival. The final weeks felt strange. Women wandered the camp trying to memorize it, understanding they were leaving relative safety for chaos. The night before departure, a small gathering formed in the library. No official ceremony, just women saying goodbye to a place that had changed them. Some left notes in books they'd loved, messages for future prisoners, for future readers, for future seekers of truth. Helga left a note in her Rilke volume. To whoever finds this, you are not alone. Others have struggled with the same questions. The answers are in these pages. Anna Zimmermann, the Dresden librarian, approached Preston with tears in her eyes. I'm going back to nothing. My city is rubble. My library is destroyed. But I'll rebuild. I'll create another place like this, where people can find truth in books. Preston pressed something into her hand, a list. Authors to prioritize. Books that counteract totalitarian thinking. Start with these. Build from there. The morning of departure came cold and clear. Women loaded their few possessions, some clothes, letters from home, and books. Preston had given each woman one book to keep, a gift for the journey. Margaret received her Hesse, the volume she'd first discovered. Inside the cover, Preston had written, Knowledge is the bridge. Cross it whenever you can. Major Hartley stood at the camp gates as the trucks prepared to leave. He saluted, a small gesture of respect even for defeated enemies. The trucks rolled out past the library one final time, past the building that had held their transformation. Some women waved. Others simply looked, trying to hold the image in memory. The journey back to Germany was long. Ships across the Channel, trains through France, arriving finally in a country they barely recognized. Ruins everywhere, cities reduced to rubble, people hollow-eyed, starving, traumatized. The occupation zones divided Germany like a pie. British in the north, American in the south, French in the west, Soviet in the east. Each zone different, each bringing its own version of peace. Margaret returned to Stuttgart, now in the American zone. Her family's apartment building was a shell, but her mother had survived in the basement. They embraced, two women made strangers by war and separation. That night, by candlelight because electricity was sporadic, Margaret told her mother about Camp 18, about the library, about books given freely, about education offered without condition. "I don't understand," her mother said. "They treated you better than enemies? They treated us like humans who had been lied to, like people worth saving." In the weeks that followed, Margaret began teaching. Informal classes in basement rooms, in refugee centres, in any space she could find. She taught reading to women who'd never learned properly. She taught English to those who wanted to understand the occupiers. She taught history that wasn't propaganda, science that wasn't twisted to serve ideology, literature that wasn't censored. And she told everyone about Camp 18, about British guards who gave prisoners books, about the choice between burning knowledge and sharing it. Helga settled in Hamburg, in the British zone. She found work as a translator, then as a teacher in a school being rebuilt from rubble. She taught English using the methods Preston had used with her: patience, encouragement, exposure to great literature. Her students learned language not through rote memorization, but through reading Wordsworth, Dickens, Shakespeare. They learned that English was as rich and complex as German, that other cultures had equal value, that superiority was always an illusion. Anna Zimmermann, the Dresden librarian, faced the hardest task. Dresden was in the Soviet zone, its libraries destroyed by firebombing and war. But she began rebuilding anyway, collecting books from anywhere she could, organizing them with the same care Preston had shown. She created reading rooms in damaged buildings, loaned books to anyone who asked, refused to let knowledge die even in the midst of devastation. And she always kept one shelf for the books that had been banned. Mann, Hesse, works by Jewish authors, anything the Reich had tried to erase. "Never again," she would tell patrons, "never again will we let anyone tell us what we can or cannot read." Major Edmund Hartley continued serving in Germany during the occupation, working on educational reform, helping to rebuild German universities free from Nazi influence. He never spoke publicly about his time running Camp 18, considering it simply duty performed, but he kept letters from former prisoners, women who wrote to thank him, to tell him how they were using what they'd learned, to prove that his faith in education's power had been justified. Corporal William Preston returned to civilian life as a librarian in Leeds. He wrote a memoir about his camp service that few people read initially, but which later became important to scholars studying how to deprogram extremist ideology. His central thesis was simple: you cannot argue someone out of beliefs built on propaganda, but you can expose them to so much truth that the lies eventually collapse under their own weight. Books are slow weapons, but they're the most effective ones we have. What happened at Camp 18 and places like it was not widely known for decades. It didn't fit comfortable narratives. It was too complex, too nuanced, too much at odds with simple stories of good conquering evil. But it was real. German POWs, including thousands of women, were held in British camps during the final years of the war. Many camps had libraries. Many commanders believed that education was the key to preventing future conflicts. And those encounters between women who had been taught hatred and captors who offered knowledge became a small but significant part of denazification. Historians later noted that German POWs held in Britain returned home with complicated perspectives. They had experienced the contradiction of being better treated as prisoners than free Germans were in their own country. They had seen an enemy who responded to Nazi book burning by giving them libraries. They had learned that respect for education and human dignity created stronger societies than intimidation and censorship. These experiences didn't instantly create democrats, but they planted seeds of doubt about totalitarian ideology. They proved that propaganda could be overcome by direct exposure to truth. They demonstrated that even enemies could be transformed through knowledge. The camp where Margaret Weber spent 1 year no longer exists as a POW facility. The buildings were repurposed after the war, used for various purposes, eventually torn down. If you visited the site today, you would see only fields, perhaps a historical marker noting that a camp once stood there. But the impact of what happened in that space ripples forward. Every student Margaret taught about questioning authority instead of blindly obeying. Every person Helga helped understand that other cultures have equal worth. Every book Anna preserved against those who would destroy knowledge. Every mind opened by exposure to ideas previously forbidden. The German women who encountered British camp libraries for the first time expected nothing. They assumed their enemies would treat them as they'd been taught, with cruelty, with degradation, perhaps with the same brutality they dimly suspected their own government had shown others. What they found instead was books. Shelves full of authors their government had banned. Knowledge their leaders had tried to suppress. Education offered freely, without condition, without mockery. And in that gap between expectation and reality, something extraordinary happened. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but real. People changed their minds. People learned to question. People chose to build their lives on different foundations. That is the quiet victory that no army can achieve alone. That is the transformation that happens one person at a time, one book at a time, one moment of recognition that knowledge is more powerful than propaganda. In the end, it wasn't British military might that defeated Nazism in those women's hearts. It wasn't occupation or punishment or forced re-education lectures. It was the simple experience of being given books by people they had been taught to despise. That is the lesson that echoes across decades. That is the truth that survives when all the propaganda is forgotten. That is the hope that remains when everything else has been destroyed. Humanity is not determined by nationality, ideology, or the accidents of birth. It is chosen daily in small acts of sharing knowledge. It is proven by how we treat those we have power over. It is built by people who, having every reason to withhold education, choose to offer it instead. The women who left Camp 18 in late 1945 carried that lesson home with them, back to a destroyed nation that needed to learn it more desperately than anything else. Some shared it, some lived it, some passed it on to children and grandchildren. And somewhere in that chain of transformation, Germany became something different than it was. Not perfect, not redeemed, but better. Better because people learned that books matter more than borders, that knowledge defeats hatred, that education is the only real path from darkness to light,